Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Ed Horde, and on the behalf of the Sabbatical Programming Committee, we want to welcome back to GSL Dr. Steve Haynes. Today he's going to be talking about the journey and power of wellness, recovery, and wholeness. And of course, this aligns well with Recovery and Wellness Sunday, as well as our fall theme for spiritual, mental, and physical wellness for the parish. Just briefly, Dr. Haynes holds degrees from Emory, Columbia Theological Seminary, Florida State University, and Vanderbilt, and he's been at Rhodes since 1989. He is teaching courses on the Holocaust, Bible and its reception, mass incarceration, and religion and addiction. Sorry for the cheat notes. He's been recognized numerous times for and received awards for teaching and research. He's a graduate of Leadership Memphis, and since 2016, he has directed the Rhodes Liberal Arts in Prison program at West Tennessee State Penitentiary. He has written many books on Jewish and Christian relations, and on the biblical and religious scholar Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And also, as I think he's going to be talking about today, the book, Why Can't Church Be More Like an AA Meeting, and Other Questions Christians Ask About Recovery. So help me welcome Dr. Haynes.
What did I do with my little thing? Yeah, that's pretty important. Okay. Hi, everybody. It's good to be back. Hey, Laura. It's good to be back in this space. Lots of father-daughter dance memories from this space. I had a daughter who graduated from GSL and a while back. She's 33 now, so you do the math. We still talk about father-daughter dances. It's funny the things that stick with you. At any rate, good to be here and to have some time to talk to you about. I don't know where the title that Ed read came from. I didn't write it, so I'm going to talk about my book, which is called Why Can't Church Be More Like an AA Meeting. It came out in 2021, and it's like other things I've written, it's a reflection of my own experiences, my family's experience, and relates really well to recovery issues. So I'm going to start talking very personally about my own recovery story, and it actually begins in 2008. My wife, Elise, some of you may know her, got to the point in her life where a lot of deferred trauma that she had experienced growing up would not be deferred anymore. It became very difficult for her to sort of keep going without some kind of deep work. And so we found a place for her to go in Arizona called the Meadows. It's a really good place. We were very fortunate that we could afford it. And it's a place where a lot of celebrities go. We didn't know that at the time, but anyway. One of the things, she went for a typical stay, which is I think 28 days, and then ended up staying several months after that. But one of the things that the Meadows does, like other treatment facilities, is to have something called family programs. And this goes back really to the 1950s, where addiction treatment increasingly began to be seen as a family process. And there were family programs, family days, family weekends. Meadows does a family week. I can assure you it looks nothing like this. There is no, people getting together on the couch and talking about how happy they are. In fact, my memory from Family Week, I went, by the way, was everybody at the end of the day driving their rental cars back to the little place where we stayed and walking into the rooms with their heads down and closing the shades so they could be alone. It was really, really hard. The problem is, what made it so hard for me is I went to help her, and it turns out that I am part of a system in which she exists, and guess what? I'm part of the problem. And so all my issues, I guess I was 50 at the time, all my issues, my divorce that I hadn't fully processed, my relationship with my kids, all the stuff that I needed to look at was illuminated in this week. And so I came back with a very different view of our family, our relationship, and all that. And I looked for a place in Memphis where I could do some of the work that I had been introduced to in Arizona. It turns out there's a place like within a stone's throw of here called the Experiential Treatment Center, Experiential Healing Center. It's actually right near Idlewild where I go to church. Never heard of it. It's on Lockett Place. And it turns out this is not my wife and I at Experiential Healing Center, although it pretty much sums up kind of where we started, not exactly on the same page. There are a couple of therapists there who are very skilled, Michelle Rappaport and Kent Fisher. They focus on addiction and trauma. They've developed this specific modality they call SOMEX, which is experiential, an experiential intervention. I'm going to talk more about that if we have time. And they were trained by a woman named Sharon Vegscheider Cruz, who is a kind of a famous person in the study of family addiction and the way it connects to family systems. So I was in the right place. And one of the things they said to us, so my wife got back, we started going there together. One of the things they said is, you need to go to this place called Recovery Couples Anonymous. I had never heard of it, wasn't much interested. They said, you need to be willing to do whatever we tell you to do. Just trust us on this. So we were. And so we went to this place in a church, in a Sunday school room at a church in East Memphis. And turns out we looked on the website before we went. We saw they had lots of different resources. Neither of us had ever been to a 12-step meeting. We were really kind of nervous and didn't know what to expect. But it turns out that there is a 12-step, there's an RCA meeting in Memphis, and it's not something you find in every city. In fact, between Atlanta and St. Louis, Memphis is the only one. What we didn't know at the time is that people drive from 50, 100 miles away to go to this particular meeting. It meets Saturday at 5 o'clock. It was not a great time for me. You know, it was in the fall, football, right? College football, but decided to go anyway. So we get there, and they start reading these, they pass out these readings, and people start reading them aloud. And we didn't know at the time, but all these readings are adapted from the readings that happen at AA meetings. So what we learned was that the only requirement for membership in this particular fellowship was the desire to remain and committed to each other. And we had that much, at least at that time, and developed new intimacy. Our primary purpose as a group is to stay committed in loving and intimate relationships, to help each other, help other couples achieve freedom from dysfunctional relationships. So this was, we thought, yeah, we were willing to do that, and we qualified in that respect. So the next thing that happens at these meetings is they pass out this reading called How It Works, and this comes again from the AA Big Book. And so one of the things that's emphasized is rigorous honesty. This is this sort of thing without which recovery doesn't happen in any fellowship, is rigorous honesty. We told people, we listened mainly of people telling their stories about what we used to be like, what happened, and what we are like now. We found out there were lots of people in there who had been in places like we were, trying to figure out how to go forward, whether our relationship was sustainable, whether we could deal with all the invaders of a blended family. And we were encouraged because people talked about hope. It was the only place that we really heard hope. We were afraid to talk about our problems in our church, even though we had been going there. I had been there for a long time. It just didn't seem like the place where you really told the truth about what was going on in your marriage if everything weren't fine. So we were looking for a place where we could really be honest. So people talked about dealing with addictions, past hurts, misbehavior, vows violated. Generally in RCA, one, and you go as couples, at least one member of the coupleship, which is the word that's used there, at least one member of the coupleship is part of another 12-step fellowship, but not always. And people go there for all kinds of reasons. It's sort of, they want to sort of preempt any problem that's coming. There's been some sort of blow up in the relationship. They're struggling with these outside invaders. So, and there was a lot of God. And if you've never been to a 12-step meeting, this is probably one of those things that will surprise you more than anything else. God's in 6 of the 12 steps. People talk about God all the time. For a secular fellowship, it's got a lot of God in it. And so it made me both feel comfortable and and hopeful, but it also made me wonder why I hadn't been able to get this stuff like in church, or when I was doing a PhD in theology, or when I was becoming an ordained minister. Anyway, more on that to come. Here are the steps we took. And so this 12 steps of RCA are just an adapted version of the 12 steps of AA, which you may be familiar with. We admitted we were powerless over our relationship, as opposed to over alcohol, that our lives together had become unmanageable. Came to believe, can you see? Okay. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to commitment and intimacy. Made a decision to turn our wills and our life over to the care of God as we understood God. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of our relationship as a couple. So all of these steps are adapted to fit, right, a relationship and a couple, rather than an individual struggling with a particular substance. Admitted to God, to each other, and to another couple the exact nature of our wrongs. One of the unique features of RCA is that sponsorship happens in couples. So we were a couple working with a sponsor couple, which is a really interesting kind of thing to do. It was really important for us because we needed to talk to them. We had a couple therapist, but we didn't have problems on the schedule that our couples therapist was available. So we called our couple sponsor all the time and talked to them, in a 4-way call quite a bit. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character, communication, and caring. Humbly ask God to remove our shortcomings. And then comes the amends part of the 12-step program. Made a list of all persons we had harmed, became willing to make amends to them all. This is as a couple. Made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. We continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it to our partner and to others we had harmed. So this is a skill that actually is pretty valuable in life in general, certainly in a coupleship. I just used it this week. I did something, was really short with my wife on a phone call. It had nothing to do with what we were talking about. I had to call her and apologize. Maybe you're good at that. I'm not. I stink at it. It's hard. This is one of the things you learn to get better at in recovery. We sought through our prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood God, praying only for God's will for us and the power to carry it out. And then step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to other couples and to practice these principles in all aspects of our lives. One of the things I'll emphasize in the sermon, if you're here at 10:30, is recovery is a way of life. It's not something that just applies to a particular struggle you have. It's something you apply in every aspect of your life, whether or not you're struggling with a substance or a behavior at that particular time. So after the steps are read, there's another reading, How It Works, Part 2. And because your first response is, I don't know if I can do all that. That seems like a lot. Do not be discouraged. The point is that we're willing to grow together along spiritual lines. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. This is one of the sort of mantras of 12-step recovery. It's about progress, not perfection. You're going to have slips. You may have full-blown relapses. You may question your commitment in this relationship. It's okay. It's part of the process. So you're left at the end of this series of readings with 3 pertinent ideas. Our relationship had become unmanageable. We certainly were there. Despite our best efforts, we were headed for separation or divorce. We were actually separated at this time. People don't really understand separation. If people hear that you're separated, they think of it as, stage 1 to a divorce, which it wasn't for us. So it was hard to explain to people what we were doing, but we certainly knew that we needed something. No human power could have restored us to commitment and intimacy. God could if God were sought. So that's kind of where we were. And then at the end of every meeting, there's this remarkable series of words called the promises, which is what keeps you coming back. Because if there's any chance that the promises are going to come true for you, it's worth sticking around. If we're honest about our commitment and painstaking about working the steps together, we're going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. As we experience mutual forgiveness, we'll not regret the past. Trusting each other will return. No matter how close to brokenness we have become, we will see how our experiences can benefit others. The feeling of uselessness, shame, and self-pity will disappear, and so on and so forth. Our whole attitude and outlook on life will change. We will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. And so you start to imagine that those things are possible, and it keeps you coming back, as we did. So in the book, I have 12 chapters. It seemed, appropriate. Chapter 1 is called "Why Can't Sunday Be More Like Saturday?" And that has to do with my experience on Saturday nights, and then following that up with my experience Sunday mornings, which, like you, is when I go to church. So this is not a picture of RCA, but it's basically what RCA felt like. It felt like an informal space where people were connected spiritually. One of the things that happens typically after 12-step meetings is people go out to a meal. And in this case, we went out to dinner, and that was the best part, right? You got to talk to people that you would probably never really get to know in ordinary life. We didn't have a lot in common with them, but we had this connection that was hard to describe. And then on Sunday morning, I went to church. This isn't exactly what it was like, because I didn't openly sleep in church, although my wife would say I do sometimes close my eyes during the sermon. Not when I'm preaching. But this is how it felt. Everybody was really well dressed. Everybody was paying attention and very, pulled together. But there was separation. There was no connection. And it got increasingly difficult for me to go to church on Sunday because the disconnect between those two experiences was so profound. How is it that I, as an ordained minister in this tradition, as a staff member of this church, can so little look forward to going to being with my people? The reason was I'd experienced something on Saturday night that I knew Sunday morning couldn't come close to. So I started to think about this paradox, and I went to heard about this retreat. This was in 2015 on spirituality and recovery at a place in Texas, and I decided to go. It was put on by a group called the NACR, the National Association for Christian Recovery. Had no idea there was such a thing. I went to this meeting, drove all the way to Austin. I don't recommend that. It's a lot farther than it looks on a map. I did have a good friend, a good Episcopal friend who went with me, so that was okay. But turns out these were my tribe. These were people who were Christians, but had also found recovery and were looking for some way to bring the two together. And I remember just being amazed that there are these people out there, and I found them. And so this is a turning point for me. So I started to really think about this question that I had, which is, why can't church be more like an AA meeting, an RCA meeting? And I realized that people had been asking this question for a long time. Going back to the 1940s, there had been questions about, does the church have something to learn from AA? Why can't church be more like AA? And so there were these early articles. Oh, I have a little pointer here, I think. Yeah, there were these early articles, and then starting about 2007, there's just a flood of them. For some reason, in the early 21st century, people started to really ask this question again and again and again. Church planners, pastors, lay people. That's the wrong direction. Yep. So another thing I started to do is wonder if anybody had written any books about this this experience of a sort of professional Christian, somebody who's ordained, or maybe a professor, or somebody who's in a monastery, experiencing recovery and trying to understand it in terms of their faith. Turns out I found 6 right out of the chute. One called The Hunger for Healing by Keith Miller, a book by Nate Larkin called Samson and the Pirate Monks. I don't know why it's called that. Anyway, Ashamed No More, A Pastor's Journey Through Sex Addiction, Sober Mercies, How Love Caught Up with a Christian Drunk, Thirst, God and the Alcoholic Experience by a seminary professor named James Nelson, and Seeds of Grace, Reflections on the Spirituality of Alcoholics Anonymous by a nun named Molly Monahan. And so I read these books, I devoured them. I was really curious, what they said. And what I found was that they basically described in their fellowship, in their 12-step fellowship, whatever it was, an atmosphere that they had never found in church. And this is how they described it. People present themselves in their brokenness. People are seeking transformation. They're not going because that's what you do. They're not going to be seen. They're not going because they want their kids to go. They're there seeking something very deep. They find acceptance, belonging. There's no judgment. There is only embrace. People, if you're a newcomer, people will share their phone number with you, their email address to reach out. It's an atmosphere in which people thrive in informality. There's no leader in a 12-step meeting, which is a little anarchic at first, but there's a sense of sort of egalitarian presence where everybody's sort of on the same level. That's nice. And the pursuit is of progress rather than perfection. So, wondering why this picture is up on the slide, I bet, right? It's because one of the ways that AA and other 12-step meetings have been described is as a spiritual kindergarten. And I found this really useful. So this is a quote from the book. These recovery memoirs share a narrative arc in which Christians who struggle with addiction or dysfunction find in 12-step fellowships a sort of spiritual kindergarten, to use the phrase coined by AA founder Bill W. It is certainly counterintuitive to think that people with advanced degrees and extensive religious training need to begin anew their process of spiritual formation, but the memoirs suggest this is often what is required. For these professional Christians, the lessons taught in recovery's spiritual kindergarten include surprise, insight, and transformation. So the thing I found in common with these books is this sense that people, despite feeling like they had probably more to give than to get, found it was just the opposite. They had a lot to learn. So some of the surprises that these people describe, that 12-step groups are teeming with Christians. If you're like me, the first time you go in, you're likely to see people from your own church. It's kind of a surprise. You're wondering why they're there. They're probably wondering why you're there. But they don't want to be outed, or they don't feel like their church is a comfortable place to claim to be a recovering addict. There's also surprise that their Christian faith can present obstacles to recovery. I'll talk more about that in the sermon, but steps 2 and 3 seem like they should be natural for Christians, or Christians should just pass right by them. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. So we'll just go to step 4 because we've already done all that. Here's the problem. All that good spiritual work that and credit you've accumulated over years in church, it didn't keep you from being where you are today. So maybe you want to rethink kind of that part of it and go slowly. One of my favorite stories, a friend of mine who's a pastor in Houston, decided to get sober, decided he would get a sponsor who was very unlike him, so he gets a biker sponsor. And he's really struggling to stay sober, and so he has a meeting with his biker sponsor, and he says, the biker sponsor says, the problem is you've never really done a good second step. My friend has a PhD in theology like I do. He says, dude, I've got a freaking PhD in the second step. He said, I know that's your problem. So that's kind of where a lot of us find ourselves in recovery. So there's a sense of spiritual superiority sometimes we bring in, a suspicion toward the disease concept. This can't be a disease. It's got to be some kind of personal failing. This has to be my fault. I really don't want to talk about it. And then this frustration, this sort of combination of wonderment and frustration that the spiritual fruits of recovery have somehow eluded us in the church or churches we've been going to for a long time. And then these insights start to appear. Recovery cannot begin until one hits bottom. Although the bottom doesn't have to be low. As people in AA say, the elevator goes all the way down. You can stay on it, or you can get off now. The missionary impulse is misguided, right? The idea that you're going to be there to help people, maybe explain to them what religious belief is really about. You need to probably keep your mouth closed and your ears open. Your conception of God may be part of the problem. And then this sense of transformation that eventually happens. This is a quote from the book. These Christian authors speak of the recovery in terms of transformation that is both gradual and hard-won, for it requires nothing less than ceding control of one's life to God, fearlessly identifying character defects, reassessing priorities and values, restoring broken relationships, and choosing a life of humility and service. This transformation is often accompanied by a recognition of the difference between belief and experience, between statements of faith and vital religion. This part here I'm going to talk about in the sermon, and I basically make the point, like, we learn a lot of movements in church. We're asked to do a lot of things. One thing we're never asked to do is turn our lives and our wills over to the care of God. Like, to trust God, absolutely. So this is kind of a new thing when it sort of dawns on you that that's being asked. So what is the recovery ethos? So when people ask, why can't church be more like an AA meeting? What are they really getting at? Well, here's my attempt to put it on one slide. So I think this is what I get from reading other people's stuff and from my own experience. Authenticity is one of the first things. People are present in their brokenness. The second is a seriousness of purpose. People are there in search of transformation. Acceptance. People find belonging and connection. Non-judgmentalism. No self-righteousness. No shaming. Informality. No dress code. It's kind of nice. No hierarchy. Leaders are servants. That's how you lead. And finally, messiness. So one of the interesting things that AA claims is that if you're an alcoholic, you never stop being an alcoholic. The question is, are you a sober alcoholic or are you an unsober alcoholic? Or maybe you're a dry alcoholic, which means you're not drinking, but you still have all the characteristics of an alcoholic, which is probably the worst kind of person to be. You should be drinking. We'd appreciate it if you drink, right? So, but this idea of sober addicts is really crucial, right? We're in recovery. We never quite are completely transformed. We're in the process of transformation. And that creates some messiness, right? We're not one thing or the other. We're both at the same time. It's a lot like being justified sinners. And so theologically, it makes a lot of sense, right? We're justified, we've been cleansed of sin, and yet we're still the human beings we've always been. So why can't church be more like AA? So here's some suggestions that just from my observations. The link between church and respectability. Especially churches like, let's just be honest, like Grace St. Luke's and Idlewild. Like, it's a respectable place to be. And you don't want to air your dirty linen, your sort of family secrets, your failings, your struggles in a place where respectability is sort of the coin of the realm. Intellectual sophistication. So this one's interesting. If you know anything about 12-step fellowships, they traffic in really simple mottos like let go and let God. Right? How can anything as simple as that actually be the solution to a problem as difficult as addiction, right? I think a lot of us have that question in the back of our minds. So that's another thing. Personal struggles viewed as incompatible with piety, right? If I'm really a pious person, if I'm really the person I appear to be on Sunday mornings, I can't admit to have any personal struggles. And by the way, I'll get to this in a minute. Okay, fear of surrender and powerlessness. Not fun to acknowledge powerlessness, even if we know in our hearts it's there. Spiritual pride, I've got the God stuff down, don't need anything, I don't need another spiritual path, I found mine. And then I have to be fine. So this is step 0. This is my contribution to 12 steps, step 0. Step 0 is, despite all appearances, we were not fine. So for Christians especially, until we get to step 0, got no chance with the rest of them, right? And when we get together, this is how we greet each other. How are you, Steve? I'm fine. You? Fine. How are your kids? Fine. How are your kids? Fine. Everybody fine? We're fine, right? We do that even though we know we're not fine. We know we're not fine. But that's what we do because we're respectable people and, this is church. So there's got to be some way to sort of break through that for us to even begin to imagine the possibility of acknowledging powerlessness over anything. Okay, so what it all adds up to? Churchiness. Anybody remember the church lady from Saturday Night Live? Yeah. This is lost on younger people, so I'm really appreciative of the fact that you have some recognition. Church's failure to resemble 12-step fellowships is in part a paradoxical result of their success in shaping believers who are respectable, smart, and pious. That's us. Who desire to be seen as respectable, smart, and pious, and who are encouraged to present themselves this way by other Christians pretending that they too are respectable, smart, and pious. This ethos, which might as well be called churchiness, creates natural limits to a congregation's capacity for embracing recovery. So there you have the dilemma. So I wasn't going to do the slide, but I guess since it's here, I will. So one of the things I was interested in studying was the different ways that Christian groups orient themselves toward the 12 steps. So there are groups that reject them because they're not Christian enough or because they're somehow flawed. There are groups that embrace them absolutely, just as another sort of version of the gospel. And then there are groups that try to adapt them. So adaptation takes a lot of different forms. The idea is, yes, the 12 steps are useful, but the message must be adapted to suit Christians. And there's a range among adaptation schemes, and one of them, on one end, you have people trying to make AA more like the church. How can we make AA more like church? And on the other end, you have people trying to make the church more like AA. And so in this, if you've ever heard of Celebrate Recovery, and I'm sure you have, it's the most successful church growth movement of the last half century. There are something like 30,000 Celebrate Recovery chapters or ministries around the world. The idea is to sort of bring recovery into the church and remove some of the edges that make some Christians uncomfortable. And then there are groups like the Recovery Church movement that I'll talk about in a minute that are trying to sort of make church more like AA, do what I'm talking about in the book, which is take the features of AA and other 12-step fellowships that Christians really long for, even if they don't know it, and make them part of the church experience. Okay, so when I do this presentation, and I did it 2 years ago to the Recovery Ministries of the Episcopal Church National Conference in New Hampshire, I tend to feature local ministries as examples of the ways that churches have tried to integrate recovery. And so one example I use is Hope Church in Cordova. It used to be called Hope Presbyterian, but in a post-denominational age, a lot of churches are dropping those denominational names. If you look at their website, you'll see a whole list of 12-step and other support groups. And not only that, they have some for sexuality as well. You'll find a list of support staff. So this is one model where a church not only offers meetings on Sunday nights, I think it is, all sort of on the same hallway, but also people who will help you get to the meeting where you want to be and people who you can contact. So this is one model. Another model, I use Grace St. Luke's Episcopal Church to exemplify, because you have a Wellness and Recovery Sunday, for instance, which is what we're doing today. Also, if you look at the church website, there's this bit about addiction and recovery. There's also a reference to the various 12-step meetings that meet here. I don't know how many fellowships there are, but 3 or 4 at least, which is something that is, I think, an important statement about the church's valuing of recovery. There's a place in East Tennessee, Powell United Methodist, that has a Thursday night meeting called Recovery at Powell. So this is a special service that is sort of built around a 12-step model. It doesn't take the place of the Sunday service, but it draws a lot of people into the church that maybe are not churchgoers or don't go to that church, but feel like this creates a space for them to be part of the community. And they have a recovery pastor as well. There's in Tupelo a place called the Orchard Church. This is a formerly United Methodist church. They left the denomination a couple of years ago. The Orchard has in their Tupelo campus, they have a Thursday night service called Thrive, which is both a service and also like an alternative church, because my sense in going there was that the people who go on Thursday nights don't necessarily go on Sunday. This is kind of their congregation. It's very 12-step oriented. They have a recovery pastor. The night I was there, he preached about his own time in rehab and so forth, so it's very recovery friendly. So this is another model. As I've traveled around the country, I've found lots of other models. One of them was in Brooklyn, the Recovery House of Worship, which is, it's now spread to quite a few places in the Northeast, Brooklyn, Bronx, Staten Island, Coney Island, and then several places in New Jersey and California. So this is a movement that's growing. This is one that's really interesting because I found it just by happenstance. My parents used to live in Vero Beach, Florida. I was looking for maybe a place that had a recovery service, and it turns out there's this thing called the Recovery Church Movement that has these church services up and down the east coast of Florida, including Vero Beach. And it's more like the Thrive model, which is that it's a separate church that exists around recovery. It meets in another church. It meets in another church's building on a weeknight, but it's not part of that church. It's has its own minister, its own staff, its own vestry, and so forth. And so it's a really interesting model. So it's a church without a permanent church building, but that's built around recovery. The way they describe themselves is as a bridge between the 12-step fellowships and the church. So it's an attempt to really integrate the two in an interesting way. So here is kind of the current state of the Recovery Church movement. It's spread beyond Florida, and it's gone throughout the United States. And you get a sense of like their idea of church. This is a church service where the minister wears shorts, right? This is not the Episcopal Church, right? It's much more kind of thing you would find in a 12-step meeting, right? I also went to conferences and retreats as I was researching the book, just that I thought would be interesting. So one of them was the Episcopal Diocese of Texas at Camp Allen. Beautiful camp. It was the Diocesan Recovery Commission put it on. This was in 2017. It's gone now. There's a lot of the Recovery Commission is no longer in operation in the Diocese of Texas. So there's a lot of fluidity in these ministries, even in the Episcopal Church. A guy I met in Austin, former Episcopal priest. I guess he's current Episcopal priest, retired, name's Bill Wigmore. His ministry is something called two-way prayer. He's taken this sort of approach to prayer that the early AAs had developed called two-way prayer, and he tried to integrate it, tried to re-envision it and sort of bring it back for a new generation of people. And he set up this small intentional community called the Sam Shoemaker community, where people live according to a sort of common rule based on the 12 steps. There's a great podcast if you want to learn more about him, Father Bill W. podcast. And then the last thing I'll mention is 12-step outreach. If you're familiar with centering prayer, this is a sort of Catholic meditation practice that was developed by Thomas Keating, who died recently. He also developed this 12-step outreach ministry, which is a step 11 ministry. So step 11, anybody remember what that is? Yes. Sought through prayer and meditation, develop our conscious contact with God, seeking only to know God's will and to carry that out. So this is an attempt to like provide some Christian content, some spiritual content to the 11th step for people who maybe they meditate or they pray anyway, and this helps them sort of adapt that for 12-step recovery. So this is a sense of kind of what it looks like, what the whole panoply looks like. I also visited a lot of Celebrate Recovery meetings. I won't go into that, but I visited all over the country. I also went to one of their big meetings at Saddleback Church in California where there were 3,000 people present. It was like a rock concert. So there are all sorts of ways for the church to endorse recovery, provide recovery, begin to reflect the ethos of recovery. Grace St. Luke's represents one way. There are lots of others. I know we're supposed to quit at 10:15, so I'm going to stop there. See if you have any questions.
Can you show photos of some of the staff members at these churches or programs who kind of lead these efforts? What kind of training or background? I hope I'm not immediately jumping to hierarchy here. That's part of
I don't know.
Antithetical.
Yeah.
But do they? I mean, obviously pastors, would have that kind of
Yeah.
educational track. But is there like a therapy component or other things, or is it really just living and being in the world and having the passion for it?
That's a really good question. Yeah, so you mentioned one of the sort of things that doesn't fit very well in a church environment, which is the sort of non-hierarchicalism of 12-step fellowships. But you do want people on pastoral staff who know what they're doing, know what they're talking about. I don't know what the requirements, what the qualifications are of these people. I suspect they're in recovery themselves, and they may have some sort of background in therapy, but I don't know exactly. It's a good question. It'd be an interesting question for a church like this to ask if we're going to hire somebody like this, right? Do we need a priest? Do we need somebody, is that not important? Do we need somebody who's not a priest, right? We do not want a clerical collar in this person, whatever it is. What else? Yeah.
What are your thoughts on any type of recovery program associating your sobriety with your relationship with God? Like if it hinges upon, because that's one of the difficult things is being able to come back again for your, for your white chip to come back and be new again. But if it's so closely linked to, I'm trying not to name any certain recovery groups, but if the recovery group is like if your sobriety is based upon your closeness with God, which I think it is also, but to say out loud, then you weren't trying hard enough on your relationship with God. What I've seen some recovery groups who use the 12 steps or try to, in the movement of trying to make recovery more like church, then making it difficult to go back to both. If you want.
I'm trying to think of a response that doesn't involve profanity.
Yeah.
I just think that's a complete misreading of the 12 steps and 12-step culture, which is a culture of progress, not perfection, and messiness, and honesty about one's slips and one's difficulties. And if you can't be honest in a 12-step environment or a church that's 12-step inflected, then I don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
I'll just be honest about that. One of the things that makes me trust the people that I'm in recovery with is that they're honest about where they are and that they are willing to pick up a white chip. One of the things that makes them trust me is because I'm willing to pick up a white chip.
Yeah.
Good question, though. Obviously, I have some strong thoughts about that, in case it wasn't clear.
There is a recovery church service on Friday nights.
Yeah.
I think it's a Methodist.
The way. Yeah.
Yeah. The way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another model, actually, and I don't have it in the presentation, but I've been there several times. It's really remarkable because it is a church service built completely around recovery. And last time I went, at least, the message was 12-step based. There's somebody gets up and does a little moment about a particular step. Yeah.
Well, and we have November 22nd. Did you already ask about that, Lucy?
Yes, we have the Episcopal We still have a diocesan
Yeah.
commission for addiction and recovery, and we have frequently have a recovery Eucharist, 12-step Eucharist, and our next one is November 22nd at Barth House at 5:30. So, and we have it's a 12-step Eucharist, and we have been having like an open 12-step meeting and refreshments. So there's some little postcards out by the display, the recovery display out down the hall.
It's so beautiful because we go through the 12 steps. Right? Like when you said that, God is in, you said a number of steps.
Yeah.
Like God is in all the steps.
Yeah, right.
That's what you realize when you come to it. And it was always the gospel.
Do you mind going back to the slide with the book so I can take a picture of it?
The books,
Yes.
like the 6 books,
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
can do that. Do we need to quit, Laura?
Well, it's probably soon time to wrap up. Yes, maybe one final question or comment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just saying thanks because I think this is just so interesting. Oh, thank you, because this is so interesting. I never heard about the couple recovery,
Yeah.
anonymous, whichever.
Yeah.
But I do go to an 11th step meeting on Thursday mornings for Al-Anon, and it is fabulous. It's
Yeah.
just
Where is that?
It's at St. Luke's
Uh-huh.
on Highland,
Uh-huh.
10
Oh,
o'clock.
yeah, Methodist Church, yeah.
St. Luke's
That's
Methodist.
nice
yeah.
to know. I didn't know there were any 11th step meetings in
Yeah,
Memphis.
it's a fab. I have often thought when I was there how marvelous it is that there is this openness there, and people talk about. I realized that I'm not relying on God, and I thought, wow, that is not something that you hear very often at church.
Yeah.
It's just not. So there we
Thanks.
are.
That's
So
fun.
thank you for the book. I can't wait to read yours.
Good. They make great holiday gifts. I'm just saying. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it.